Today we're going to look at the lives of three women whose stories are recorded in the book of Acts. The first woman, a Jew, was born and raised in Israel. The second and third woman probably weren't Jewish. The second woman was from Turkey, but had moved to Philippi, a city of Macedonia, which is now in northern Greece. The third woman was from Italy, but had moved to Corinth, which is in the south-central Greece. Philippi and Corinth are about 450 miles apart. Only the first woman might have had the opportunity to meet Jesus, since she lived in Israel, and the time frame fits. The other two stories are about women whose stories happen much after the resurrection. What they had in common was their conversion to Christianity. All three were industrious. Two were involved in the clothing industry. One made clothes and gave them away. Another sold purple cloth. The third woman was also a seamstress, but she sewed tents. None of the three had children, or at least their children's names were not recorded in the Bible. As we look at the lives of these women, it's important to realize the historical context of women's rights. They had certain rights because they lived as free people in the Roman Empire. Women could inherit equally with their siblings upon the death of their father. Upon the death of their spouse, their dowry would have been returned to them with interest. More importantly, however, was they lived at a time that Christianity had already begun influencing relationships, particularly among believers. Skeptics often accuse Christianity of having a low regard for women and treating them as second-class citizens. Well, there's no denying that many professing believers, past and present, have been guilty of this. The view from the scriptures is radically different. Unique among all religions and philosophies with roots in the ancient world, the biblical worldview presents both women and men as created in God's image, thus co-equal in value and dignity. In fact, a group of prominent women played a vital role in Jesus' earthly ministry, providing financial support as well as being the first witnesses of his resurrection. This pattern was reinforced during the early years of the church. The book of Acts is peppered with the stories of women that would have raised eyebrows in the first century and might still today. These women aren't the stuff of Sunday school picture books. They're real, and they're diverse. Household servants, tradeswomen, business leaders, intellectuals, and they're essential to the church understanding of itself and any era or culture. First, we're going to talk about Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. Tabitha is Aramaic and Dorcas is Greek. She lived in the city of Joppa, which is now part of Tel Aviv. Tabitha was a Jewish woman who was best known for the miracle that she was resurrected from dead. You know, people wouldn't forget that. However, we know more about her than many other women of her time because of her sterling reputation. Tabitha was a woman of at least moderate wealth, as she was able to provide so much assistance to her friends and neighbors. Typically, a widow was always counted among the poor. Without a husband to support them, they depended on their family or friends. This does not appear to be the case with Tabitha. She was able to assist other poor women, some of whom were also widows, by sewing clothes for them. She must have inherited some money from her father through his death or the recovery of her dowry after the death of her husband. It is possible, however, that she sewed clothing for a living, which she sold as well as sewing clothing for her friends who couldn't afford to buy their own. What role did Tabitha play in the church? Luke describes Tabitha as a disciple, and she was the only woman in the Bible so designated. In fact, she was never described by any other word. What a compliment to be that you act just like Jesus because of her compassion. Tabitha was a doer of deeds. She was quick to respond when someone needed help. What she did wasn't risky or heroic, but rather the consistency and length of her service was extraordinary. She made clothes. One commentator suggests that she must have dressed these widows fashionably, for as she lied, washed, and prepared for burial, they tearfully displayed her work to Peter with obvious pride. She also helped those who were hurting. She's called by both her Jewish and Greek names, which might reflect that her ministry was both to the Jewish and Hellenistic believers. Widows did not have Social Security or pensions to back them. If they were to be cared for, it was her family or her church that did so. Apparently, Tabitha's unique compassion and her contribution was so important to Joppa Bible Church that when she died, God raised her back to life. In the Bible, there are about 10 recorded incidents of people being raised from the dead. In the Old Testament, both Elijah and Elisha each raised young men. Jesus is recorded of raising people from the dead on 3 different occasions, and at his resurrection, others were raised from the dead. In Acts 20, verse 9 and 10, Paul raised Eutychus, who'd fallen asleep during a sermon, and here Peter raised Dorcas. Tabitha lives in us on as an example of the Christian life, as one of servanthood. She voluntarily served the poor people of her town, and her actions were so powerful that people were sent to Peter for him to do something upon her sudden and untimely death. We don't know that they asked him to raise Tabitha from the dead, but he apparently thought that was the best solution. As a result of her resurrection, the Bible states in verse 42 that many people believed in the Lord just because of that. I'm not surprised. Lydia. Lydia was from the town of Thyatira, in the region of Lydia, which is now modern-day Turkey. She was described as a seller of purple, which meant she either made the dye, sold purple cloth, or might even have sold clothes that had already been made, or a combination of all 3. She was drawn to Judaism, but was not Jewish. She lived in Philippi, which at that time had a negligible number of Jews, too few to establish a synagogue. In about AD 49, about 20 years after the death of Jesus, she was converted to Christianity. In Acts 16, she was described as one who worshiped God before she met Paul. Like Cornelius before her, Lydia was a Gentile, attracted to the God of the Jewish scriptures. Once she was converted to Christ, she placed her home and considerable resources at the disposal of Paul and his ministry team, even after they had been released from prison. In doing so, she provided a bridgehead for the apostles' mission as it moved down into Greece and eventually across Europe. Lydia was not married at the time that she was converted to Christianity. Some scholars believe she was a widow, but it's possible that she was never married. Because of her occupation, she was wealthy, and she could afford a comfortable lifestyle. It is probable that her home had many different rooms and could have even had running water. I know. A successful businesswoman, she definitely had household servants and probably employed others in her business. During one of Paul's missionary journeys mentioned in Acts 16, he and Silas probably visited in the town where Lydia was from. The church at Thyatira is mentioned as one of the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. What role did Lydia play in the church? Lydia provided Paul and others with him not only with a safe sanctuary to relax, but also a place where his immediate needs could be met. After Paul's release from jail, he returned to Lydia's home. The house was large enough to support Paul, Silas, and Luke, and perhaps others with him. On Paul's missionary journey, she also hosted the nascent church in their home. She impressed upon Paul to stay at her home without a husband mentioned or other male with whom she needed to consult, the common practice for a woman at that time. Lydia provided this resource to Paul immediately upon her conversion. This, however, was not a decision that came without consequences. She gave what she had to the cause, her home, her resources, her wealth, and she took a risk to do so. In the Roman Empire at the time, her conversion would not have been pleasing to her clients. And she didn't stay quiet about it either. By allowing Paul and the others to use her house as their home base, even use her home as a church, well, she could have lost her client list in a flash. And she may have. We don't know. We can surmise that she was willing to. Now let's talk about Priscilla. What was Priscilla's background? Priscilla and Aquila came to Corinth from Italy as victims of Roman persecution. The Emperor Claudius had expelled all Jews from Rome sometime between AD 41 to AD 54. Aquila, who was Jewish at that time, left Italy entirely, not just the capital city. Priscilla occupied a relatively modest niche in first century Roman society. Together with her husband Aquila, she ran a small business in Corinth, making tents. In modern terms, Priscilla and Aquila were artisans or tradespeople. They were also a cross-cultural couple. Unlike her husband, Priscilla likely wasn't Jewish, but a Roman woman from the upper-class family, judging by her name. After meeting and working with Paul, the well-traveled duo became valued members of the apostles' missionary team. Priscilla wasn't Jewish, but she was a Christian. She and her husband are always mentioned together. Frequently, her name is given first. The proof that she wasn't Jewish is that her name wasn't Jewish. What is a tent maker? Today, when we think of tents, we have a picture in our minds of going camping. In biblical times, the majority of inhabitants lived in houses made with bricks and roofs, which might use wooden trusses. However, tents were used by the Roman army and other visitors as they traveled. Being a tent maker meant you constructed or repaired tents. In Bible times, tent makers wove camel or goat hair to produce strips of cloth. Then they sewed the strips together to make tents for travelers. Many tents in this period, however, were made from leather. Others were made from linen, which was manufactured in Paul's hometown of Tarsus. Paul may have worked with only or all of these materials. While working with Aquila, though, Paul may have made linen sun awnings that were used to cover the atria of private houses. Tent making was an easily portable trade, which Paul could use to support himself while traveling. It required weaving, sewing, and leatherworking. The socioeconomic status of tent makers remains unclear. On the one hand, tent making definitely fell into the category of manual labor and may have involved particularly unpleasant work, like tanning leather. But on the other, tent makers' artistic skills probably placed them above common laborers in the eyes of the populace. And Although artisan workshops were generally family-run enterprises, they frequently employed slaves and could become quite large and lucrative, with the owners acting in a managerial capacity rather than engaging in hands-on work. Of course, Paul emphasizes that he has indeed worked with his own hands. What role did Priscilla play in the church? Paul resided with Priscilla and her husband when he first arrived in Corinth. It is unclear if they had been converted prior to Paul's arrival, but they did become Christians. After spending about 2 years with Paul in Corinth, they traveled with him to Ephesus, a large city of about 25,000 people. These two cities are about 300 miles apart. Ephesus was located in what is now modern-day Turkey and relatively close to where Lydia had resided. Priscilla and Aquila stayed in Ephesus after Paul left, and during this time they invited Apollos to live with them. His knowledge of the scripture was limited, and during the time he stayed with Priscilla and her husband, they were able to explain the way of God more adequately to him. The couple is mentioned 6 times in the New Testament. Besides the references in Acts chapter 18, they are also mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verse 3, and 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 19, and 2 Timothy chapters 4, 19. In 2 of these incidents, Paul sends greetings to Priscilla and Aquila, and in the third case, mentions that they were sending greetings to the church from Asia. The fact that they are mentioned by name indicates the significance of their hospitality and work for the church. 3 women, each responding to the gospel, and their lives were changed. They lived in different time periods, different locations, and came from various economic and social status. Although none were poor according to the standard of the day, they each faced a challenge in their service for God. However, what they had in common is more important than their uniqueness of the qualities mentioned in Proverbs 31. Several particularly apply to these women. The first quality is their generosity. Tabitha made clothes and gave them to women in need. Lydia and Priscilla opened their homes for guests, and Lydia even provided a place of worship for the early church. A second quality, diligence. Tabitha had provided assistance to many women that the poor women of the early church depended on her. Paul lived with Priscilla and her husband for at least 2 years. Can you imagine having a house guest that long? Their services lasted throughout their lives. The last quality is that of wisdom. All 3 women were committed to their service. Tabitha was the only woman in the Bible to be described as a disciple. The definition of a disciple is someone who follows someone else in order to become like them and continue their work. Not only did Lydia become a Christian, but her entire household was baptized. She must have been able to help explain to those in her household what had been told to her. Priscilla and her husband were specifically mentioned as being given the task to help educate Apollos. 3 women, Tabitha, Lydia, and Priscilla. What a blessing it is to hear about them.